Welcome back to the deep dive. This time we're going back to the 1950s to China, just after the Communist Party won the Civil War.
Yeah.
You've sent us some amazing sources on how the CCP basically took over.
Yeah.
And wow, there's a lot to unpack.
It's a really interesting period and often misunderstood.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring how they established their authority, what methods they used,
Right.
and what it meant for, the lives of everyday people.
Yeah, get ready for some serious aha moments because we're talking about like huge mass movements, intense propaganda,
Oh, yeah.
and there's even this thing called the Iron Rice Bowl.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you'll like that one.
I'm already very intrigued.
By the end, I think you'll have a really good understanding of this time in Chinese history, its lasting effects.
Right.
And you might even see some parallels to, how power works in the world today.
Okay, let's dive right in. So first things first, how did the CCP actually structure their government after they took control? I mean, it wasn't just like a straight up dictatorship right now.
Not at first glance, no. They set up this system that seemed democratic. They had these assemblies with representatives from different political parties.
Yeah.
But there was a catch. It all comes down to this group called the Politburo.
Okay.
They were the real power players, positioned right at the top of the CCP's structure, their hierarchy.
Oh, so it's like a hidden power structure.
Yes.
Within a system that's sort of like faking being democratic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gets even more complicated, though, because they had all these party cadres strategically placed throughout every level of society.
Okay.
So imagine, like, in every village, every town, every city,
Right.
there's this network of loyal CCP members.
Okay.
That's how they made sure their control reached every corner of the country.
Wow. So it's like they were weaving this web of control.
Exactly.
That's kind of creepy when you think about it. And you mentioned this thing called the Banwai system. What was that all about?
So the Danwai system, that's where the CCP's control over people's lives really gets magnified. Imagine work units that dictate basically everything for you.
Yeah.
Your housing, your food rations. You even needed their permission to get married or travel.
Wait, you're kidding?
Well, it's kind of like if your workplace suddenly had that kind of power over you.
Wow. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So it's starting to feel a bit like, Big Brother
Yeah.
with this web of control and then the Danwai system on top of that. But how did they convince hundreds of millions of people to go along with all of this? I mean,
Well, it was a very carefully planned blend of propaganda and terror. On the one hand, they flooded the country with CCP ideology. Mass rallies, newspapers, radio broadcasts.
right.
There's films.
So they basically just controlled the narrative, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like an early version of like what we might call fake news today.
Yeah,
But just like on a massive scale.
exactly. But it wasn't just about like shaping people's minds. It was about instilling fear as well.
Right.
So they had public executions, labeled any opposition as these dangerous counter-revolutionaries. And those who didn't conform, they got sent to labor camps called Laogai.
It's kind of chilling to think about, the scale of all this.
Yeah.
I mean, our sources mention millions of people suffering in these camps.
That's right. Yeah. And one document we have, it mentions that there was a general target of one execution for every 1,000 people.
Wow.
And local officials, they actually had to keep track of these numbers.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's pretty horrifying.
Speaking of control, the sources describe these like all these anti-campaigns against, intellectuals, the bourgeoisie, they called them,
Right.
corrupt officials.
Yeah.
Why target those groups specifically?
Well, these campaigns, they weren't just about eliminating opposition. They were about actually reshaping Chinese society
Right.
to fit the CCP's vision. It's like they were trying to erase certain parts of the past and rebuild the country according to their ideology.
So it was about seizing power and transforming how people thought and how they lived.
Exactly.
Wow, they really wanted to build a whole new world.
They did.
One of our sources mentioned this concept of thought reform,
Yeah.
targeted specifically at intellectuals. What was that all about?
Well, intellectuals, particularly those who had been educated in the West
Okay.
or at missionary schools, they were seen as a threat to the CCP's ideology.
Okay.
They were viewed as potential agents of what they called like this imperialist cultural invasion.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so it was a big deal.
So how did this thought reform work? What did they do to these people?
Well, intellectuals were forced to confess their wrong ideas, and they had to go through these intense study sessions
No.
focusing on Mao Zedong thought.
Okay.
And then they were expected to publicly embrace the CCP's ideology.
So imagine just like having to denounce everything you believe in
Yeah.
just to survive.
Exactly.
It's heavy.
Yeah, it was pretty intense. Okay, so we've seen how the CCP under Mao Zedong really took control after that civil war. They built up that whole hierarchy, strategically placed all those party members
Right?
throughout society, used that Danwei system
Yeah.
to control daily life, especially in the cities.
It's wild how they managed to like gain such comprehensive control over people's lives.
It really is. And remember, they used this potent mix of propaganda and terror.
Yeah.
Think about those those anti-movements. They
Yeah.
weren't just about like getting rid of the opposition. They were about completely reshaping Chinese society according to the CCP's vision.
Yeah, and those quotas for executions, it's just
I know.
it's a chilling reminder of the human cost of this power shift.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about like control and repression, right?
Well,
They also tried to like make some big social and economic changes.
exactly.
Like redistributing land.
Yeah, they had this vision, right, of
Yeah.
creating this like socialist utopia
Right.
and turning China into this modern industrialized nation. But their approach to these reforms wasn't always straightforward.
Oh,
They
okay.
would kind of like go back and forth between these radical policies and then more, pragmatic approaches.
So like almost like experimenting on a national scale.
Kind of, yeah, just seeing what worked.
Yeah, wow.
And those policies often, had unintended consequences.
Right.
Like when food production actually went down after they redistributed the land.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, trying to transform a society as big and as complicated as China.
Right.
I mean, there were bound to be like hiccups along the way.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Sure. But let's move on to another big area of reform, the economy.
Okay.
So when the CCP took over, right, they inherited this economy that was, mostly agricultural,
Right.
and it had been, totally ravaged by war.
So they had a massive rebuilding project.
Oh, they did, yeah. Their first goal was just to get things back on track
Right.
and increase production. So to do that, they introduced this series of 5-year plans,
Okay.
which were inspired by the Soviet model.
5-year plans. That sounds pretty intense.
Oh, they were.
Yeah.
These plans, they set these ambitious targets for industrial growth, agricultural output, infrastructure development.
Right.
It was very top-down, centrally planned approach.
So the government was basically just like in charge of everything.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
The state controlled all the means of production. They set the prices.
Right.
They decided how resources would be allocated.
Wow. That's a huge shift.
It was.
From China's like traditional economy.
It really was. And it has this huge impact
Yeah.
on people's lives. It led to like rapid urbanization
Okay.
as people moved from rural areas to cities to work in factories.
So a whole new urban landscape kind of emerged.
Exactly. Yeah, with factories popping up everywhere.
It sounds like a period of just immense change.
Yeah.
Turmoil. I can only imagine the challenges the CCP faced,
Yeah.
trying to balance like their ideological goals with the practical reality
Yeah.
of governing such a vast and diverse nation.
Right.
It makes you wonder, did everyone really benefit from these reforms? Were there some people who were like left behind?
That's a really important question. And unfortunately the answer is no. Not everyone benefited equally.
Yeah.
While some prospered under the new regime,
Right.
a lot of others suffered.
Right.
The push for rapid industrialization often came at the cost of things like worker safety
Right.
and environmental protection.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
It is.
It seems like, progress often comes with this hidden price.
Yeah, for sure.
And because the CCP prioritized heavy industry,
Right.
consumer goods were often in short supply.
Exactly.
So even though the economy was growing, like the standard of living for a lot of people
Yeah.
remained pretty low.
It did, yeah. There was this gap between the CCP's, narrative of progress
Right.
and the reality for a lot of people.
And what about those who tried to speak out against these inequalities?
Well, remember, the CCP's suppression of dissent,
Yeah.
anyone who dared to criticize the regime or their policies
Yeah.
faced really harsh consequences.
It's a sobering reminder
It is.
that progress is rarely evenly distributed.
Right.
And that those in power often silence the voices of those who disagree.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Okay, so we've covered, land reform and economic transformation.
Right.
But what about other areas of reform? Did the CCP try to, like, reshape Chinese society in other ways?
They did. Social reform was a major focus for the CCP.
Okay.
Their goal was to create this more egalitarian society.
Right.
Break free from those traditional hierarchies and inequalities.
Yeah.
So they introduced policies to improve women's rights, expand access to education, provide healthcare for everyone.
Those all sound like really positive changes.
On the surface, they were.
Okay.
But as with their other reforms, the reality was more complicated.
Okay.
For example, while, women gained legal equality,
Right.
they continued to face, discrimination in their everyday lives.
So it's like the laws change, but social attitudes
Right.
take a lot longer to catch up.
Exactly. And then when it came to education,
Yeah.
the CCP's tight control meant that education was often used as a tool for indoctrination,
Oh, I see.
shaping young minds to align with their ideology.
So it wasn't just about, like, providing education. It was about controlling what people learned.
Exactly.
What about healthcare? Was there a similar gap between the idea and the reality?
While access to healthcare did expand,
Right.
the quality of care was often inconsistent,
Okay.
especially in rural areas.
Right.
They often lacked, adequate medical facilities
Right.
and trained professionals.
So once again, we see this pattern of uneven progress.
Exactly.
With some people benefiting way more than others.
Yeah, it seems like a recurring theme, throughout this whole period,
Yeah.
that the CCP's reforms brought, significant changes to Chinese society,
Right.
but they also came with, a price,
Right.
and those costs weren't always evenly distributed.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. I think it's a very complex and nuanced picture
Yeah.
that often, gets overlooked in those simplistic narratives about this era.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Land reform, economic transformation, social reforms, the role of the PLA.
Right.
But I'm curious about something we haven't really touched on yet, the CCP's relationship with the rest of the world.
Okay.
Did they just, like, stay isolated, or did they engage with other nations?
That's a great question. Initially, the CCP adopted this policy that they called leaning to one side, which basically meant aligning themselves with the Soviet Union.
So like a strategic alliance with another communist power.
Exactly. The Soviets, they provided China with economic and technical assistance.
Right.
And the CCP, they modeled a lot of their reforms on what the Soviets had done.
Okay.
It was a very close partnership.
Yeah.
At least for a while.
But this alliance didn't last forever, right?
You're right. No, by the late 1950s, cracks started to appear
Okay.
in the relationship between China and the Soviet Union.
What caused the rift? Was it just like a difference in opinion, or was it something more?
It was a bunch of factors. I mean, there were ideological differences.
Okay.
There were these personality clashes between Mao Zedong and Khrushchev.
Right.
And there was competition for leadership within the communist world.
So a clash of egos and ideologies, basically.
You could say that, and the split had these major consequences for China. They lost a key ally and a really crucial source of support.
That must have been a really, really difficult time.
It was.
For the CCP. So how did they respond to this loss?
Well, the split with the Soviet Union basically forced China to become more independent.
Okay.
In its foreign policy.
Right.
So they started looking for these new relationships, particularly with countries in the developing world.
So kind of a shift from reliance on one powerful ally to a more, global outlook.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It seems like the CCP was constantly adapting and evolving its strategy in response to, both internal and external pressures.
They were. And this shift toward a more independent foreign policy, it would go on to have a huge impact on China's future.
Yeah. Okay. So we've explored the CCP's consolidation of power, their ambitious reforms, and their changing relationships with the rest of the world. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering about something. We've been focusing on the CCP's perspective, but what about the voices of, like, everyday Chinese people?
That's a really crucial question.
Yeah.
And it's one that historians are still, trying to figure out.
Right.
It's hard to get a complete picture because the CCP, they controlled information so tightly.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find like firsthand accounts
Right.
from this period.
So it's like trying to solve a historical puzzle,
Yeah.
but with some of the pieces missing.
Exactly. But, in recent years, we've seen personal diaries, letters, oral histories start to emerge,
Okay.
which give us these glimpses into what life was actually like for ordinary people.
That's amazing. What do those sources, like, what do they reveal? Do they offer like a different perspective than the like official CCP narrative?
They do, yeah. These personal stories, they paint a much more, complex and often contradictory picture.
Okay.
Than that official party line.
Right.
Some people, genuinely welcomed the CCP's reforms.
Right.
They saw them as this path to a brighter future.
Right.
Others experienced, hardship, loss, and the disruption of their traditional way of life.
So kind of a mixture of hope and disillusionment,
Yeah.
depending on who you were and what you experienced.
Exactly. And a lot of people, lived with this constant sense of fear,
Right.
knowing that the CCP's, surveillance apparatus, it extended into every corner of society.
It's a powerful reminder.
It is.
That even like the grandest narratives of historical change
Yeah.
are ultimately experienced, on a personal level.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to acknowledge, the human cost of these transformations.
Yeah.
Even as we analyze the broader political and economic forces at play.
Absolutely. It's those individual stories
Yeah.
that really, bring history to life.
They do this deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
Okay.
I mean, we've gone from the CCP's rise to power, their ambitious reforms, to their shifting relationships with the world,
Yeah.
and the diverse experiences of the Chinese people.
That's a lot.
I feel like I've just like absorbed years worth of history in a short amount of time.
It's a dense topic.
It is.
For sure. But hopefully we've given you like a solid foundation
Yeah.
to keep exploring this era on your own.
I agree. It's been quite a journey.
Yes.
Before we move on to a final thought,
Okay.
I think it would be helpful to take a moment to kind of like recap
Yeah.
key takeaways from this deep dive.
Great idea. Yeah. Let's try to synthesize what we've learned.
Okay, so we've covered so much in our look at China in the 1950s. It's just mind-boggling how much happened.
Yeah. It's a decade packed with change in power, in ideology, in everyday life. Let's
Yeah.
try to sort of like boil it down, those key takeaways.
Perfect. A mental map of this era.
Exactly. So we started by looking at how the CCP under Mao solidified their control after they won that civil war.
Right.
They built this hierarchy, placed those party members, the cadres, strategically throughout society.
Right.
Then there was the Danwei system, those work units, controlling almost every part of city life. Housing, food, even marriage.
It's just amazing to me how they created that web of control.
Yeah, and they were masters of using propaganda and terror to get people to go along with it.
Yeah.
And to eliminate any opposition. Remember those chilling anti-campaigns?
Oh, yeah.
They weren't just about getting rid of opponents.
Right.
It was a strategy to reshape Chinese society to fit their vision.
And those executions,
And right.
they weren't just random violence.
No, they were planned, calculated.
Yeah, just to instill fear and keep control.
Exactly.
It's a dark side of history, Easy to forget the human cost when we talk about these big shifts.
Absolutely. But it wasn't all just about control and repression, remember?
Right. They did try to make big changes.
Yeah, they wanted to modernize China,
Yeah.
create that socialist utopia. Land redistribution, the 5-year plans, that focus on heavy industry.
Yeah.
It did lead to some growth,
Right.
but often at the expense of things like worker safety and the environment.
Yeah. Progress and its price.
Exactly. And the social reforms, while they were aiming for equality, they didn't always hit the mark.
Right.
Women got some legal rights, but discrimination continued. Education expanded, but it became a tool for, controlling what people learned.
It's like they were building this new world, but reality kept getting in the way.
Yeah, great way to put it. And then their relationship with the rest of the world.
Right. Starting with the Soviet Union.
Exactly, that reliance. Then those ideological differences, the power struggles.
And then China having to find its own path.
A major turning point.
For sure. It set the stage for everything that came after.
And lastly, we tried to see all this through the eyes of everyday people.
Yeah, using those diaries and letters.
Exactly, to get a more nuanced picture.
It's amazing how those personal stories can challenge the official narrative, right?
Absolutely reminds us that history is about real people.
So, big question. What does it all mean? What are the lasting implications of this period for China and the world?
Well, this period laid the foundation for modern China, good and bad. The CCP is still in power, and even though their economic model has evolved, you can still see those early reforms in it.
It's incredible how those 10 years had such a big impact.
Yeah, shows how crucial they were. But also, we can learn from this era, the dynamics of power, the challenges of trying to, engineer a society.
In that constant tension, individual freedom versus state control.
Exactly. Those themes go way beyond China.
But we see them everywhere in different ways.
That's a story about revolution, transformation, and the cost of both. Progress isn't a straight line.
And trying to make a better world, well, sometimes that has unintended consequences.
Right.
Wow, what a journey. This deep dive has been eye-opening.
It's a complex topic, but I hope you've got a better understanding of what shaped China in the 1950s and how it all connects to the world today.
I feel like I've learned so much.
Good.
But it's also left me with more questions, like how did those early experiences under the CCP shape later generations in China?
A great question to keep exploring.
Yeah. Shows that history is an ongoing conversation.
It really is.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into 1950s China. We hope you'll keep exploring this fascinating and complex period.
Until next time, keep diving.